My name is Paula Carey. At 32 years old, I hold the rank of captain in the United States Army, but today I was just the daughter of retired General Thomas Carey. As I walked into the federal courthouse, my mother didn't even try to hide her smirk. She leaned into my father's ear, her voice a venomous hiss that was still loud enough for me to hear. "Look at her, Thomas. She looks like a stray dog that's dragged itself in from the desert. We should have just left her there." The pain was a familiar shard of shrapnel in my chest, but I was used to it. 7 years ago, on Thanksgiving Day, right after my father retired and took over the company, he'd raised a glass of wine and declared in front of 20 relatives, "My son is the future of this family." Then he'd turned to me, his eyes like ice. "She, on the other hand, is just a disgrace to this family name." A disgrace. That was the word they'd used to brand my life. But they'd made one fatal mistake. They raised me in the discipline of the military. And in my world, there is no disgrace that cannot be cleansed by the truth, even if that truth has to be exposed through an act of war. If you've ever been treated like an outsider by your own family, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe now, because this story is for anyone who has ever been called a disgrace. Justice is waiting. The E. Barrett Pretty Man Federal Courthouse in D.C. is supposed to be a cathedral of justice, built of imposing limestone and marble to make you feel small before the law. But as I walked through the oak doors of Courtroom 18, it felt less like a temple and more like a shark tank. The air was thick with the scent of money, and the sharks were circling in hand-stitched suits. They were the apex predators of the Beltway: lobbyists, lawyers, and political fixers. At the center, holding court from the polished defense table, were the two great whites. My father, retired General Thomas Carey, now the powerful CEO of Carey Defense Solutions, and my mother, Eleanor, a woman who had perfected cruelty into a high art. My father looked the part of CEO, his silver hair perfect, his jaw set with the same authority he once used to command a division. My mother sat beside him in a bone-colored Chanel suit, her posture a weapon of calculated elegance. They weren't just parents. They were a strategic partnership, and I was the hostile target they had come to neutralize. Their lead attorney, a man named Sterling, whose smile was as slick as the pomade in his hair, spotted me from across the room. He leaned over to his junior associate and, with a dismissive smirk, murmured, "The prodigal sheep has returned to the fold." The eyes of the room landed on me. They saw my simple black suit, the severe bun my ash-blonde hair was pulled into, the rigid set of my shoulders. They saw a soldier, out of place. I ignored them all. My training at West Point and in the dust-choked landscapes of Afghanistan had taught me how to operate in enemy territory. This was the heart of it. I began my advance toward the plaintiff's table, each step measured, my breathing controlled. As I passed the defense table, my mother made her move. She didn't look at me. Instead, she produced a delicate silk fan from her Hermes bag and began to wave it with a theatrical flourish. "My goodness," she declared to the air, her voice carrying with perfect clarity in the hushed room. "The smell of gunpowder and failure. It's simply suffocating." The words were a targeted strike. Gunpowder. The scent of service, of sacrifice, and failure. The label she had pinned on my entire career. She had taken everything I was and twisted it into something shameful. A collective intake of breath, a rustle of whispers. The humiliation was now public, exactly as she had intended. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck and burn my cheeks, but my expression remained a mask of neutrality. "Breathe, Carey," I told myself. "Control your sector. Don't give them a target." But the second attack, the one that truly found its mark, was one of absolute silence. My father, General Carey, did not even grant me a glance. He was turned halfway in his seat, deep in conversation with a congressman seated in the front row. He laughed at something the man said, a deep, easy sound that echoed with camaraderie and power. He gestured with his hands, his gold signet ring catching the light as if I didn't exist. As if his own daughter, standing 10 feet away in a federal courtroom, was nothing more than a piece of the furniture. That cold, deliberate indifference was more brutal than any insult. It was a declaration that screamed, "You are nothing. You do not matter." I flashed back to being 10 years old, my fingers aching after polishing the brass on his dress uniform for an hour, desperate for just a single nod of approval. He'd walked right past me then, too, on his way to an important phone call. Now, decades later, nothing had changed. I looked at him, at this powerful CEO basking in the glow of his new kingdom, and I no longer saw my father. I saw a stranger. I reached my destination, the simple, empty table reserved for the plaintiff. My lawyer wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes, a calculated move by their side, I was sure, to leave me exposed. I didn't sit. To sit would be to accept a position of rest. Instead, I stood at parade rest, my hands clasped behind my back, my spine straight. My gaze swept the room, cataloging exits, assessing threats by instinct. My eyes finally settled on the judge's bench and on the man sitting there. Judge Miller. A name I knew from my research. But it was his history that mattered. Retired Colonel, United States Marine Corps. A veteran of Fallujah. For a fleeting second, his gaze lifted from his papers and met mine. There was no smile, no overt sign of recognition. But in that brief shared glance, I felt a flicker of understanding. A silent communication between two people who had sworn the same oath, who lived by a code my parents had long since abandoned for profit and prestige. That was all the reinforcement I needed. I slowly turned my head, fixing my gaze directly on my parents. The whispers in the room died. They both looked at me now, their expressions a mixture of annoyance and contempt. I let the silence hang in the air for a beat, a tactical pause. Then I spoke. My voice was level, devoid of the pain and rage churning inside me, as clear and cold as a command issued on a frozen morning. General Carey, Mrs. Carey. I addressed them by their formal titles, drawing a line in the sand. I am not here today as your daughter. I let that sink in, watching the surprise register on their faces. I am here as an officer of the United States Army, executing a delayed mission. I paused, letting each word land with precision. The mission is called justice. I turned away from them then, facing forward, my eyes locking onto the large American flag standing proudly beside the judge's bench. Old Glory, the symbol of everything I had sworn to protect. I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But they don't prepare you for this at West Point. They don't teach you the proper protocol in the field manual. Who defends you when the enemy shares your name, your history, your blood? My declaration of war in that courtroom wasn't born from a single moment of betrayal. It was forged 7 years earlier, in the crucible of a Thanksgiving that felt more like a funeral. A funeral for the daughter I thought I was. It was November, and I was a first lieutenant home on leave, driving through the gilded gates of my family's estate in Potomac, Maryland. The sprawling brick manor, the manicured lawns dusted with the first frost. It was a picture of American success. But as I stepped inside, the atmosphere was wrong. My father had been retired for only a few months, trading his general's stars for a CEO's title, and the very air in the house had changed. The comforting, disciplined scent of my father's polished leather boots and Old Spice was gone. It had been replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of new money and the incessant murmur of business calls. I'd returned with a quiet sense of hope. Months earlier, while my father was still in uniform, a critical software glitch in Project Prometheus, a flagship defense system for Carey Defense, had threatened to derail a billion-dollar contract. From my post, I had identified the flaw, worked through back channels, and anonymously fed the solution to the engineering team. It was a silent act of loyalty, not just to the family company my grandfather had built, but to the father I still respected. Now that he was officially CEO, I held a naive belief that my contribution might finally be acknowledged, that I might finally earn that nod of approval I'd spent my life chasing. But I quickly learned that in my father's new world, my kind of integrity wasn't an asset. It was a liability. Before dinner, I was in the library looking for a book. when I overheard my father's voice booming from the adjacent drawing room. He was holding a glass of scotch, speaking to my uncle. "You see, Jim," he said, his tone slick with self-satisfaction, 30 years of service to this country gave me something invaluable. Access. Now, it's time to monetize that access. It's not corruption, it's just smart business. He was talking about the revolving door, that uniquely Washingtonian mechanism for turning public service into private wealth. He spoke of it as a natural transition, a well-earned perk. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt physically ill. The legacy my grandfather, General Marcus Carey, had built on honor, on creating the best possible equipment to protect American soldiers, was being systematically dismantled. It was being turned into a cash machine fueled by backroom deals and shadowy connections. Right then, listening to him boast, I understood a cold, hard truth. I, with my rigid military code of ethics, did not fit into this new version of the Carey legacy. I wasn't just irrelevant, I was a threat. Later, we all gathered in the formal dining room. The 20-foot mahogany table was a masterpiece of my mother's design, laden with glistening silverware, crystal glasses, and a magnificent roasted turkey at its center. The air was warm with the scent of sage and thyme, and the room was bathed in the soft, forgiving glow of candlelight. It was a perfect illusion of family, of warmth, of gratitude. After the main course, my father stood, tapping his glass with a fork. A hush fell over the 20 relatives assembled. He raised his crystal glass, the amber of his wine catching the light. "I'd like to propose a toast," he began. But it wasn't a toast of thanks. It was an announcement. As the new CEO of Carey Defense, it is my great pride to announce that my son, Ethan, will be joining the company as its new executive vice president. A wave of enthusiastic applause erupted around the table. My brother, Ethan, preened, accepting the congratulations with a smug smile. I clapped along, a hollow, mechanical motion. Then the room quieted, and my father's gaze shifted, landing on me. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a glacial coldness that chilled me to the bone. "We also have Paula," he said, the pause before my name a deliberate insult. "She is, of course, very skilled, technically." He let the faint praise hang in the air for a moment, before delivering the killing blow. "But she's too rigid, too idealistic. A fine officer, I'm sure, but not a team player." He turned his address back to the rest of the table, dismissing me as if I were a footnote. "My son," he declared, his voice swelling with pride, "is the future of this family, the future of this company." Then he looked back at me one last time, his eyes devoid of any emotion except finality. He delivered the verdict that would echo in my mind for the next 7 years. She, on the other hand, is just a disgrace to this family name. Silence. A thick, suffocating silence. Not one of my aunts, uncles, or cousins met my eye. They just stared at their plates, at the perfectly arranged pumpkin pie, suddenly fascinated by their dessert forks. In that moment, they were all complicit. My humiliation was complete. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The pain was too deep for that. It was a void, a sudden, complete emptiness where a daughter's love for her father used to be. I carefully placed my napkin on the table, pushed my chair back, and stood up. The scraping sound of the wood against the floor was the only noise in the room. I walked out of the dining room, down the long marble hallway, and out the front door into the biting November night. No one stopped me, no one called my name. I got into my car and just drove, aimlessly, through the dark, winding roads of Potomac. The perfect sprawling houses with their warm, welcoming lights felt like a mockery. I turned on the radio, desperate for any sound to fill the crushing silence in my head. A woman's voice, warm and steady, filled the car. "And what the research shows us is that vulnerability is not weakness," she said. "It's not about winning or losing. It's the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome." I pulled over to the side of the road, the engine idling. I didn't know it at the time, but the voice belonged to a researcher named Brené Brown. Her words didn't heal the gaping wound that had just been torn open in my soul. They couldn't. But they gave me something else. They gave me a mission. the courage to show up and be seen. One day, I swore to myself in the cold darkness of that car, I would show up. And I would force them all to finally see me. Brené Brown's words gave me a mission, but courage doesn't pay rent. The morning after that Thanksgiving, my exile became official. My mother, in a final act of administrative cruelty, had my credit cards frozen and my access to our family accounts severed. The message was clear: I was not only disowned emotionally, but financially. I was on my own. With the few $100s of cash I had in my wallet, I found a tiny attic apartment for rent in a worn-down brick building in Arlington, Virginia. It was all I could afford. The room had sloped ceilings that I kept bumping my head on, and a single window that overlooked a grimy alley. The air was perpetually stale, smelling of dust and desperation. Back at my father's estate, there was a temperature-controlled wine cellar worth more than this entire building. But here, in the suffocating quiet of these four walls, listening to the radiator hiss and clank through the night, I felt like I could finally breathe. The air was thin and poor, but it was mine. My diet became a monotonous rotation of instant ramen noodles, saltine crackers, and peanut butter eaten straight from the jar with a plastic spoon. The hunger pangs were a constant, dull ache in my stomach, a physical reminder of my new reality. I lost weight I couldn't afford to lose, and dark circles formed under my eyes like bruises. I was adrift, but I was not broken. I was a soldier. I knew how to survive. My first priority was securing my flank. My parents, not content with simply disowning me, had launched a whisper campaign, subtly suggesting to their contacts in the Pentagon that I was unstable, a potential security risk. To fight back and clear my name, I needed a lawyer. And lawyers cost money I didn't have. So, I began a grueling double life. By day, I was Captain Paula Carey, an intelligence officer at the Pentagon. I arrived for duty at 500 hours, my uniform perfectly pressed, my boots gleaming, my face an impassive mask. I endured the suspicious glances of my colleagues and the pointed questions from my superiors, executing my duties with flawless precision, knowing that any mistake would be used as ammunition against me. By night, I was just Paula, a ghost hunched over a laptop in a cold attic. I found a freelance job translating complex technical manuals for a small engineering firm. The work was mind-numbingly tedious, but it was anonymous and paid in cash. My evenings bled into early mornings, fueled by cheap, bitter black coffee that I brewed in a second-hand pot. 4 hours of sleep became a luxury. The loneliness was a physical presence in the room, a heavy blanket that threatened to smother me. In my weakest moments, the image of my father's cold eyes and my mother's mocking smile would flash in my mind, and the memory, once a source of pain, became a potent stimulant. It was fuel. It kept me going. One Tuesday night, my old Honda Civic sputtered and died on the side of the George Washington Parkway. It was raining, a miserable, bone-chilling drizzle. As I sat there, hazards blinking, trying to get a tow truck on the phone, a sleek black Mercedes sedan pulled up beside me. The tinted window glided down, revealing the face of Arthur Vance, one of my father's oldest business partners. He looked me up and down, taking in my drenched coat and broken-down car. A pitying, condescending smirk played on his lips. "Well, well, Captain Carey," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Heard you'd run into a bit of trouble. Need a hand?" His offer wasn't about help, it was about humiliation. It was a power play. "I heard you're between residences," he continued, enjoying himself. "If you ever need a more accommodating line of work, you give me a call." He winked, the implication disgustingly clear. Every instinct screamed at me to unleash the fury coiling in my gut. But I didn't. I just tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles turning white, and looked straight ahead into the rain-streaked darkness. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," I said, my voice flat and steady. "I can manage on my own." He chuckled, the window slid up, and the Mercedes sped away, splashing a wave of muddy water onto my car. I sat there for a long time, not moving, just breathing. That night, sleep was impossible. I flipped on the small television in my room, and by chance, I stumbled upon a documentary. It was about the life of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I watched, mesmerized by her story, her quiet tenacity, her unwavering fight against injustice. And then, they showed a clip of her speaking, her voice frail, but her words like steel. "Fight for the things that you care about," she said, "but do it in a way that will lead others to join you." The words sliced through the fog of my exhaustion and despair. It was like a light had been switched on in a dark room. I had been operating purely on survival instinct, fueled by anger. I was fighting, yes, but I was fighting alone. Her words gave me a new strategy. My war couldn't be a reckless, head-on assault. It had to be an intelligence campaign. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I needed evidence. I needed proof. And most of all, as the late Justice had so wisely advised, I needed allies. I got up and walked to the small cracked mirror above my sink. I looked at my reflection, the tired eyes, the gaunt face. But then I looked at my hands. They were no longer the soft, manicured hands of the general's daughter. The pads of my fingers were calloused from hours of typing. A small cut from fixing the leaky faucet was healing on my thumb. They were the hands of a survivor. They were the hands of someone who was building a new life, brick by painful brick. For the first time in a long time, I saw not just what had been taken from me, but what I had built in its place. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was ready for the next phase of the mission. The decision to build a case against my own family was made in the lonely quiet of my attic apartment. For weeks, that decision felt like a solitary burden, a heavy rucksack I had to carry alone through hostile territory. I spent my nights mapping out strategies on a corkboard, timelines, and names connected by red yarn, feeling like a conspiracy theorist in my own life. Then, one night, everything changed. It was close to midnight. I was staring at my board, the web of names and connections blurring before my tired eyes, when a sharp knock echoed from my apartment door. I froze. My body went rigid, my senses instantly on high alert. No one ever came here. No one even knew I lived here. I moved silently, my bare feet making no sound on the cold floorboards. Peeking through the peephole, my heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. On the other side of the door was a man in a simple gray hoodie. For a second, I didn't recognize him. Then my mind caught up. Jake Evans, Sergeant First Class, retired. Army Ranger. The man whose life I'd pulled from a firefight in Kandahar. His face was framed by the dim, flickering light of the hallway, and in his hands, he held a brown paper bag that smelled faintly of bacon and coffee. I unlatched the 3 locks and opened the door. He gave me a small, tired smile. "Heard you were in the neighborhood," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Figured your MRE rotation was getting a little boring." He held up the bag. It had the bright yellow logo of a Waffle House on it. I stepped back, letting him in, a strange mix of suspicion and relief washing over me. He walked into my Spartan room, his presence immediately filling the small space. He took in the corkboard, the stacks of documents, the single mattress on the floor, but his face registered no pity, no surprise. Just a quiet assessment. "It's not much," I said, my voice raspy from disuse. "It's a forward operating base," he corrected me, setting the bag down on the floor. "Needs some fortification, but the location's secure." We sat on the cold floor, the takeout boxes spread between us like a battlefield map. He'd brought waffles, scrambled eggs, and bacon. So much bacon. For me, after weeks of ramen and peanut butter, it was the most extravagant feast I could imagine. Steam rose from the food, carrying a scent of simple, honest warmth that filled the entire room. We ate in a comfortable silence at first. Jake didn't press me with questions about my family or the lawsuit. He didn't offer condolences or try to analyze the situation. Instead, he just started telling stories. He talked about our time in Afghanistan, reminding me of the ridiculous donkey that used to wander onto our base, or the time a sandstorm had turned everything, including our coffee, a gritty shade of orange. He recounted old jokes and shared updates on guys from our unit. And for the first time in months, maybe years, I laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was a real, deep from the belly laugh that felt rusty and unfamiliar. It felt like breaking the surface of the water after being held under for too long. With every story, with every shared memory, the icy armor I'd built around my heart began to thaw. Jake's presence was like a small, steady campfire in the frozen landscape of my life. He didn't see me as a victim or a disgrace. He saw me as his captain. He saw me as a soldier. When the food was gone and the empty boxes were stacked to the side, a quiet stillness settled over the room. The weight of my reality came rushing back in. "Why are you really here, Jake?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. He looked at me, his gaze direct and unwavering. There was no pity in his eyes, only a fierce loyalty that I recognized as the bedrock of the soldier's code. "Kandahar province," he said simply. My leg was shattered. We were taking heavy fire from 3 directions. I was out of ammo. You could have pulled back. Orders were to pull back. He paused, letting the memory fill the space between us. But you didn't. You laid down cover fire and dragged my sorry ass back to the wire. You told me, no one gets left behind. So, he finished, his voice dropping slightly. Here I am, Captain. Tears I didn't even know I had pricked at the back of my eyes. I fought them back, clenching my jaw. Then he said the words that changed everything. The words I had desperately craved from my own blood, my own father. "And about this crap they're pinning on you," he said, gesturing vaguely towards my corkboard. "I don't believe a word of it. I was there. I know your integrity. I trust you." I trust you. 2 simple words. From a brother in arms, they meant more than any legal vindication or financial settlement ever could. It was the validation I had been starved of. It was a lifeline. When he saw that I'd composed myself, he reached into the pocket of his hoodie and pulled out something small and black. A flash drive. "I didn't just come here to bring you breakfast," he explained, a ghost of a smile on his face. "I retired a couple of years back, started a small private investigations firm with another guy from the 75th. We've got a certain set of skills." He held out the flash drive. "When I heard you were in trouble, I started digging. Just a little preliminary recon." He placed the small piece of plastic and metal into my palm. It felt impossibly heavy. "It's not much," he said, echoing my earlier words about the apartment. "Just some interesting financial irregularities I found in Kerry Defense's public filings going back a few years. A starting point." I closed my hand around the drive, the cool metal a stark contrast to my warm skin. I looked down at it, then back up at Jake. The knot of loneliness that had been clenched in my chest for so long, finally began to loosen. The mission was no longer a solitary one. I wasn't just a disgraced daughter fighting a hopeless battle. I was a commander, and I had just found my first soldier. "What's the next objective, Captain?" he asked, his eyes sharp and focused. For the first time, I had an answer. The flash drive Jake gave me was a key. It opened a door into the labyrinth of my father's business dealings, and for 2 weeks, we worked relentlessly from my attic apartment, turning it into a makeshift command center. We spent our nights tracing shell corporations and offshore accounts, connecting dots that formed a disturbing picture of greed and corruption. For the first time since my exile began, I felt a flicker of hope. I was no longer a victim reacting to their attacks. I was an operative gathering intelligence for a counteroffensive. Then, the enemy made their move. It happened on a Tuesday morning. An unknown number flashed on my burner phone. I almost ignored it, but my training kicked in. Never refuse intel. I answered. "Paula, darling, it's your mother." Her voice was a syrupy concoction of warmth and affection that I hadn't heard in years. It was so jarringly out of character that every nerve in my body went on high alert. Psychological operation incoming, I thought. Phase 1, disorientation. "I know we've had our misunderstandings," she cooed, the word a masterful understatement of the war she had declared on me. "Your father and I miss you terribly. We were thinking, why don't we have lunch? Just the 3 of us." At the Four Seasons, like old times. The Four Seasons in Georgetown. It was a calculated choice. It wasn't just a restaurant, it was a symbol. It was where we celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, promotions. It was a place woven into the fabric of my childhood, a place of supposed safety and happiness. This wasn't an invitation, it was a summons back to their territory, wrapped in the camouflage of nostalgia. A small, foolish part of me, the part that still wanted a mother, felt a pang of something akin to hope. The rest of me knew better. An intelligence officer never willingly walks into an ambush, but she also never refuses a meeting with the opposition. "I'll be there," I said, my voice neutral. I walked into the opulent, sun-drenched dining room of the restaurant exactly at noon. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and quiet power. They were already there, seated at a pristine table draped in white linen, smiling as if I were just a few minutes late for a weekly family brunch. My father stood to greet me, kissing the air beside my cheek. My mother squeezed my hand, her touch surprisingly firm, her nails perfectly manicured. It was a flawless performance. "Darling, you look thin," she said, her voice laced with manufactured concern. She began to reminisce, her words painting a soft focus, idealized portrait of our past. "Do you remember, Paula, right on those very steps outside, your father taught you how to tie your shoes? He was so patient, wasn't he? We were such a happy family then." A knot tightened in my stomach. She was weaponizing my memories, taking something pure from my childhood and using it as a tool of manipulation. It was a classic gaslighting technique. Create an alternate, idealized past to make the painful present seem like my fault. My aberration. "You were always my strong girl," my father added, his voice a low, paternal rumble. Code for stubborn and difficult. My internal translator supplied. After the waiter took our order, the pleasantries dissolved. The real objective of the mission was revealed. My father slid a slim, dark blue velvet box across the table. I didn't need to open it. I could see the iconic silver lettering, American Express. Inside, I knew, would be a Centurion card. The black card, unlimited credit, unlimited power. "I've had your accounts reinstated," he said, his tone that of a benevolent king bestowing a favor upon a wayward subject. "And there's a new condominium waiting for you at the Watergate, fully furnished. Let's put this unpleasantness behind us, Paula. It's time to come home." My mother leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "All those nasty allegations, the legal troubles, we can make it all disappear. Like it never happened. All you have to do is sign this." She produced a sleek leather folder and pushed it across the table next to the box. I didn't need to read the whole thing. My eyes scanned the headings. Non-disclosure agreement. Relinquishment of all future claims against Carey Defense Solutions and its principals. The trap was sprung. The picture was now crystal clear. This wasn't about reconciliation. They didn't want their daughter back. They wanted to buy my silence. They had assessed my situation, my poverty, my isolation, and concluded that my honor had a price tag, a black card and a condo at the Watergate. They looked at my 7 years of struggle, of building a life from the ashes of their betrayal, and thought they could erase it all with a checkbook. The last, fragile flicker of hope inside me died, and in its place, a cold, clean anger ignited. It wasn't the hot, messy rage of a wounded child. It was the focused, precise anger of a soldier who has just seen the enemy's true intentions. I calmly folded my napkin and placed it on the table. I hadn't touched my food. I didn't touch the velvet box or the leather folder. I stood up, my movements deliberate and controlled. I looked directly at my father, meeting his gaze without flinching. "My grandfather, General Marcus Carey, taught me what honor is," I said, my voice quiet but carrying across the table with absolute clarity. "He taught me it's the one thing you build yourself and the one thing no one can take from you unless you sell it." I let my gaze shift to my mother, who was staring at me, her perfect smile frozen in place. "He would never have sold his honor," I continued, "and neither will I." I turned and walked away. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I walked through the hushed, elegant dining room, past the tables of Washington's elite, my back straight, my head held high. I could feel their eyes on me, the stunned silence of my parents a palpable force behind me. Outside, the Georgetown air was cool and crisp. I took a deep breath, the first clean one I'd had all day. I passed a public trash can on the corner. On impulse, I reached into my pocket, pulled out the embossed business card for the 4 seasons that the hostess had given me, and dropped it into the bin. Then I took out my phone and dialed Jake's number. He answered on the first ring. "Jake," I said, my voice as cold and hard as steel. "It's me." "Captain, how did the meeting go?" "They just made a tactical error," I replied. "A fatal one." My declaration to Jake that my parents had made a tactical error was an understatement. It wasn't a mistake, it was an act of aggression. They had failed to buy my silence, so now they were escalating to a new level of psychological warfare. I spent the next few days in a state of heightened alert, working with Jake to decipher the data on the flash drive, waiting for their next move. I didn't have to wait long. The attack came not as a frontal assault, but as a quiet, digital execution. It arrived in my inbox on a Friday afternoon. The subject line was innocuous: Invitation. The General Marcus Carey Honor Scholarship Ceremony. My heart skipped a beat. West Point, my alma mater. The scholarship was an endowment my grandfather had established, awarded every year to the cadet who best exemplified the principles of leadership and integrity. For the past 6 years since my own graduation, I had been the one to present it. It was the one remaining link to my family's honorable legacy, a sacred duty I cherished more than anything. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the email. It was the official invitation, embossed with the Academy's crest. I scanned the program details, my eyes searching for my name on the roster. And then I saw it. Scholarship presented by Mr. Ethan Carey. Ethan, my brother. The corporate stooge who couldn't tell a rifle from a rake. It was a dagger to the heart. They hadn't just removed me, they had replaced me with the very symbol of their new, corrupt empire. They were erasing me from my own history, right at the place where my identity as a soldier had been forged. As I stared at the screen, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from my mother. "Probably best if you don't show up, Paula. Don't embarrass the family any further." That was it. That was the final straw. The dam of discipline and restraint I had spent 7 years building inside me finally broke. The cold, calculated anger I had nurtured turned into a white-hot, uncontrollable rage. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the lonely nights and quiet struggles coalesced into a single, explosive point. I didn't think. I just acted. My fingers flew across my phone's screen, pulling up my father's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and condescending. "Paula, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Why?" The word came out as a strangled whisper, all the air knocked out of my lungs. There was a pause. I could hear the faint clinking of ice in a glass. "The scholarship is for individuals who represent honor, Paula," he said, his tone infuriatingly reasonable. "That's just not you right now. It's time you accepted that." Something inside me snapped. A bitter, ragged laugh escaped my lips. "Honor," I repeated, the word tasting like ash in my mouth. "You're going to lecture me about honor? The man who is turning my grandfather's legacy into a dirty little business venture for your golfing buddies? The man who threw his own daughter away because she refused to be complicit in your corruption?" "Watch your tone, Captain," he warned, his voice hardening. But I was done watching my tone. I was done being the quiet, dutiful daughter. The floodgates were open. "No, you listen to me," I snarled, my voice dropping into a register he had never heard from me before. It wasn't the voice of his daughter anymore. It was the voice of a commanding officer in the field, seconds away from ordering an artillery strike. "Listen very carefully, General." I used his rank like a weapon, just as he had used mine to dismiss me. I heard his sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Your war is not with the broken-hearted girl you cast out 7 years ago. Your war is with Captain Paula Carey of the United States Army. You have violated every code of honor we are sworn to uphold. You have betrayed the legacy of a great soldier for profit. And I, as the last loyal soldier of General Marcus Carey, am holding you accountable. Every word was a bullet, fired with deadly precision. Your game is over, I said, my voice dropping to an icy calm. The bribery, the shell companies, the lies, it's all over. So you go ahead and have your little ceremony. You put my brother on that stage. And while you're smiling for the cameras, you'd better be preparing for your day in court. You are making a grave mistake, he hissed. No, I said, my voice final. My mistake was staying silent for 7 years. That mistake is now corrected. I ended the call before he could respond, my thumb stabbing the screen. The sudden silence in my attic apartment was deafening. My whole body was shaking with the adrenaline of a battle fought and won. For the first time, the crushing weight in my chest was gone. The endless burden of trying to win back their love, of trying to be the perfect daughter, it had vanished. In its place was a profound, liberating clarity. I knew who I was. I was a soldier. And I had a mission. I took a single, deep breath, feeling the cold, steady calm of a warrior before a fight. The rage was gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated purpose. If you have ever had that one final moment where you knew you could no longer stay silent, hit that like button to stand with me. And if you know what it feels like to finally draw a line in the sand, comment "no more" below. My hand, now steady, picked up the phone again. I dialed Jake's number. He answered instantly, as if he'd been waiting. Captain? I didn't waste time on pleasantries. There was no need. The time for planning was over. The time for action was now. Campaign begins, I said, my voice devoid of any hesitation. Now. My words to Jake, campaign begins. Now. Were not just a declaration. They were an activation code. The attic apartment, once my solitary refuge, transformed overnight into a tactical operations center. The loneliness was replaced by the low hum of encrypted hard drives and the scent of lukewarm coffee. Jake, leveraging his Ranger ingenuity, secured the perimeter. He installed motion sensors, swept for listening devices, and set up a closed network on a series of encrypted laptops. My corkboard, once a chaotic map of my pain, became a proper target analysis board, covered with financial statements, timelines, and photographs connected by color-coded pins. We were a 2-person task force, operating deep in enemy territory. Primary objective, I stated on our first official night of operations, pointing to a faded photograph of my grandfather in his dress uniform. We need to find General Marcus's original last will and testament. It's the keystone. Everything else, the lies, the character assassination, the theft of my inheritance, it all hinges on the fact that they made that document disappear. Jake nodded, his expression grim. I've got a thread. Your grandfather's old estate lawyer, a guy named Alistair Finch. He vanished off the map right after your grandfather passed. Dropped out of the bar association, sold his house, gone. Most people assumed he retired to Florida, but Finch wasn't a Florida kind of guy. Jake tapped a key on his laptop, bringing up a property deed. I think I know where he stashed his most sensitive files before he went dark. The next morning, we drove out to Baltimore. Our destination wasn't a law office, but a decaying old bank building slated for demolition. Using a combination of a plausible cover story and some skills I'm sure he didn't learn in any official Army field manual, Jake convinced the site's weary custodian to let us into the vault. In the dim light, surrounded by rows of silent, empty safe deposit boxes, Jake led me to a specific one at the very bottom. It was registered under a pseudonym. Inside, wrapped in a sheet of dusty, yellowed oilcloth, was a single manila envelope, sealed with a glob of dark red wax, bearing my grandfather's signet ring imprint. My breath caught in my throat. My hands trembled as I broke the seal. Inside was the will. It was simple, direct, and written in my grandfather's firm, decisive hand. And there it was, in black and white. To my granddaughter, Captain Paula Carey, I bequeath a 51% controlling interest in Carey Defense Solutions. Controlling interest. It was everything. But tucked behind the legal document was something far more valuable. It was a handwritten letter on his personal stationery. My dearest Paula, it read, I am leaving you this legacy not because you share my blood, but because you share my compass. You are a true soldier. Your integrity is your armor. Never let anyone, not even those closest to you, convince you to take it off. They will try. Do not let them break you. A single tear fell from my eye, splashing onto the crisp old paper. This wasn't just about inheritance anymore. This was my vindication. This was a voice from the past, reminding me who I was. The will gave us our legal weapon, but we needed more to prove conspiracy. A name in Alistair Finch's old files led us to our next stop, a military retirement home in the rolling hills of Virginia called the Old Guard. It was a peaceful place, filled with flags and memories, but it held a critical secret. We were there to see Mrs. Gable, my grandfather's personal assistant for over 40 years. We found her sitting in a sunlit solarium, a frail woman in her late 80s, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes as sharp and clear as a winter morning. She looked up as we approached, a knowing glint in her eye. I've been waiting for you, Captain, she said, her voice a soft, papery whisper. She knew who I was. She had been expecting me. She recounted the day years ago, when my grandfather had signed the real will. Your parents were there, she said, her gaze distant. In his study. They argued with him, pleaded with him to change it, to give everything to Ethan. Your father was insistent, but the general was a man of principle. He wouldn't budge. She paused, looking at me intently. I knew they would try something. Mrs. Gable's hands trembled as she reached for a decorative tin of Danish butter cookies sitting on the table beside her. She fumbled with the lid. Jake gently took it from her and opened it. Inside, nestled among yellowed newspaper clippings, was not a cookie, but a small square photograph. A Polaroid. She picked it up with unsteady fingers and handed it to me. The photo was slightly faded, the colors washed out by time, but the image was perfectly clear. It was my grandfather, sitting at his desk, his pen poised over the will. Standing directly behind him, with one hand on his chair, was his lawyer, Alistair Finch. And next to him, smiling brightly, almost triumphantly, into the camera, was my mother, Eleanor Carey. That smile. The same smile she wore at cocktail parties. Seeing it in this context, it looked monstrous. I took it as a keepsake, Mrs. Gable explained softly. A memory of a great man. Your mother tried to take it from me. She said it was blurry, that I should throw it out. But I kept it. I always knew it was important. I stared at the photograph, the weight of it in my hand feeling immense. This wasn't just a picture. This was a weapon. In my father's preliminary deposition for the case, my mother had sworn under oath that she was out of town on the day the will was signed, that she had no knowledge of its contents. This single forgotten Polaroid proved she had lied. It proved she was there. It proved she was part of the conspiracy from the very beginning. My arsenal was nearly complete. We had the motive. We had the proof of the crime. And now, we had the lie. I held the photo, a fragile piece of paper that had the power to detonate my mother's credibility and blow their entire case apart. As we drove away from the Old Guard, a cold realization settled over me. They had underestimated me. But now, with a weapon like this in my possession, they wouldn't just sit back and wait for the trial. They would come for me. The campaign was about to enter a new, more dangerous phase. The discovery of the Polaroid picture was like dropping a single drop of blood into the shark tank. They could sense it. My lawyer filed a motion to introduce new evidence, and suddenly, the aggressive stonewalling from my father's legal team turned into a panicked frenzy. They knew we had something. They just didn't know what. A few days later, the call I was expecting finally came. It wasn't from my father, the general, but from his pawn. My brother, Ethan. His voice was slick with false sincerity. Paula, this has all gone too far, he said, the practiced concern in his tone making my skin crawl. This isn't us. Let's meet. You, me, Mom, and Dad. We'll talk everything out, as a family, one last time, no lawyers. He suggested their private lodge in Lake Tahoe. Lake Tahoe. The name echoed with memories. It was where my grandfather had taught me to play chess on a heavy marble board by the fireplace. He taught me about strategy, about patience, and he taught me his favorite opening move, the Queen's Gambit, where you sacrifice a pawn to gain control of the center of the board. I knew this invitation was a trap, but as my grandfather's voice echoed in my mind, I realized it was also an opening. They were offering me a pawn. I decided to accept the gambit. "Okay, Ethan," I said, my voice quiet. "I'll be there." The lodge was a monument to wealth, a sprawling log-and-glass mansion nestled in the pines, with a panoramic view of the brilliant blue lake. The air inside, however, was heavy and suffocating. My father, mother, and Ethan were arranged in the cavernous living room like a tribunal. The chessboard was still there, sitting by the cold, empty fireplace. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. My father slid a thick legal document across the polished redwood table. It was another settlement offer, this one with more zeros than the last. A king's ransom. "This is the final offer, Paula," my father said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "Sign it. We put this all behind us, and you can live a very comfortable life far away from here." This was the moment, the opening move. I picked up the expensive fountain pen they'd provided. I feigned hesitation, letting my gaze drift around the room, making myself appear small and overwhelmed. I looked at Ethan, who was lounging in a leather armchair, a smug, triumphant look on his face. He saw me as a pawn, easily sacrificed and removed from the board. It was time to let him make his fatal mistake. I don't understand," I said, pitching my voice to sound weak, uncertain. I looked at my father. The lawyer, Mr. Finch, the one who disappeared. What really happened to him? My father's jaw tightened, but it was Ethan who took the bait. He let out a condescending laugh. "Oh, Paula, you're still so naive," he sneered, getting up from his chair and walking towards me, circling like a predator. He was enjoying this, the feeling of absolute power. "You really think the world plays by your little West Point honor code?" He leaned down, his face close to mine. "Look, Dad took care of the old man. Finch was becoming a problem, so he was retired. Permanently. He won't be testifying. He won't be doing anything, ever again." My blood ran cold. He said it so casually, as if discussing a routine business transaction. "Now, what do you want?" he pressed, his voice a low threat. "Do you want to take the money and have a nice, quiet life? Or do you want to end up like him?" The room fell into a deathly silence. I saw a flicker of panic in my mother's eyes. My father shot up from his seat, his face contorted with rage. "Ethan, shut your mouth!" But it was too late. The piece had been moved. The trap was sprung. I slowly placed the pen down on the table, my hand perfectly steady. The mask of the weak, frightened victim dissolved from my face, replaced by the cold, calm expression of a soldier whose target is in her sights. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and pulled out a small, sleek object. A digital voice recorder disguised as a pen. I set it on the table between us. The tiny red recording light was still blinking. "Thank you, Ethan," I said, my voice clear and strong. Intelligence confirmed. The color drained from his face. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. My father looked as though he'd been physically struck. I stood up and turned to leave, the sound of their frantic, furious whispers and curses chasing me out the door. The fresh, pine-scented mountain air felt clean, pure. Jake was waiting for me in a nondescript rental car parked down the road. He looked at me, his expression tense. "Did you get it?" I held up the recorder. "Every word." He let out a breath he'd clearly been holding. Then he handed me a second burner phone. "You need to hear this," he said. "Your father called me an hour ago. He must have gotten my number from one of his old military contacts." Jake pressed play. My father's voice, tight with a mixture of arrogance and desperation, filled the car. "Evans, I know what you're doing. I know who you are. Here's the deal. $5 million. Cash. You deliver my daughter to a location I specify, and you walk away. You refuse, and you'll find that a private investigator's license is a very fragile thing. I listened to the recording, to my own father trying to buy and sell me like a piece of property. And I didn't feel pain. I didn't feel anger. All I felt was the quiet, absolute finality of the game ending. I looked at Jake, then at the recorder in my hand containing Ethan's confession, and finally at the phone with my father's recorded bribery attempt. All the pieces were in place. The king was exposed with no moves left to make. A small, cold smile touched my lips. "Checkmate," I whispered. The day of the final hearing, I walked back into the federal courthouse, but this time, it was different. The silence of my first visit had been replaced by the chaotic symphony of a media firestorm. Reporters clogged the hallways, their cameras flashing like strobe lights, their questions a barrage of noise. This wasn't a private family matter anymore. It was a public execution of the Carey family name. Across the courtroom, I saw them. My family. But they were shadows of their former selves. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a gaunt, hollowed-out exhaustion. My father's ironclad posture had wilted. My mother's cruel smirk had been wiped clean, leaving behind the pinched, pale face of a woman terrified of losing everything. Even Ethan's smugness had evaporated, leaving only a petulant fear in his eyes. They looked like what they were, defeated. Their lawyer, Sterling, made one last desperate attempt as I walked past. "Captain Carey," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. "It's not too late for a quiet settlement. We can make this all go away." I stopped and looked him directly in the eye, my own gaze as hard and unyielding as granite. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through the courtroom's low hum. "Silence is what allowed the truth to fester in darkness for 7 years. Today, the truth is going to scream." I walked past him without another word. I was no longer the defendant in their court of family opinion. I was the plaintiff, and I was armed with the unshakable weight of the truth. The hearing began. My lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Ms. Davies, didn't waste time. She began her assault, each piece of evidence presented like a perfectly aimed artillery round. First, she submitted my grandfather's original will. A gasp rippled through the courtroom as the document, authenticated by forensic experts, was displayed on the overhead screens. I watched my mother's face turn the color of ash as she saw the clear, undeniable signature of the man whose legacy she had tried to steal. Round 2 was the Polaroid photograph. Davies projected the faded image onto the screens for the entire court to see. My grandfather signing the document, and my mother, Eleanor Carey, smiling her society smile right behind him. The same woman who had sworn under oath that she was in Palm Beach that entire week. The whispers in the courtroom grew into a shocked murmur. Perjury. Round 3 was the recording of my father's attempt to bribe Jake. The sound of his confident, commanding voice offering $5 million to betray me filled the room. The sheer arrogance of it hung in the air, thick and poisonous. I saw the congressman who had once laughed with my father now staring at him with open disgust. The final, fatal round was the recording from Lake Tahoe. Davies let the court hear the entire exchange, culminating in Ethan's smug, horrifying confession. "Dad took care of the old man. Finch was becoming a problem, so he was retired. Permanently. This is a setup. It's fake." Ethan shot up from his chair, his voice a panicked shriek, but it was too late. The damage was done. I looked at my father. The general, the CEO, the patriarch finally broke. He didn't shout or rage. He just collapsed in on himself, his head falling into his hands in utter and absolute defeat. The king had been toppled. He knew the game was over. As the chaos in the room reached its peak, Ms. Davies raised her hand, silencing the crowd. "Your Honor," she said, her voice ringing with solemnity, "I would like to conclude by reading the personal letter General Marcus Carey attached to his will." The judge nodded. The room fell silent. All that could be heard was Ms. Davies's steady voice, reading the words of a great man from beyond the grave. "I am leaving you this legacy not because you share my blood, but because you share my compass. You are a true soldier. Your integrity is your armor. Never let anyone, not even those closest to you, convince you to take it off. In that moment, a single choked sob broke the silence. It came from the gallery, from a small elderly woman sitting next to Jake. It was Mrs. Gable. Judge Miller, the retired Marine colonel, had listened to the entire proceeding with an impassive, stony face. Now, he finally spoke, his voice a low, powerful rumble that commanded immediate authority. He looked not at the lawyers, but directly at my family. As an officer who had the distinct honor of serving under General Marcus Carey, he began, his words laced with a cold, righteous fury, I am personally disgusted by what has been done to dishonor his name and his legacy. He let his gaze rest on my father for a long, damning moment. This court recognizes the legal validity of the original will, dated and signed by General Carey. Controlling interest of Carey Defense Solutions is hereby awarded to Captain Paula Carey, effective immediately. He paused, his eyes sweeping over my mother and brother. Then, he lifted the wooden gavel. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient evidence to hold the defendants, Thomas Carey, Eleanor Carey, and Ethan Carey, in custody pending federal prosecution on charges of forgery, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and potential involvement in the disappearance of Alistair Finch. He brought the gavel down. The sharp, definitive crack echoed through the courtroom like a rifle shot. It was over. U.S. Marshals moved in immediately, their movements efficient and impersonal. I watched as they approached my family. I watched them ask my father, the great general, to stand and place his hands behind his back. I watched my mother, a woman who lived for appearances, crumble as the cold metal of handcuffs closed around her wrists. In the midst of the chaos, as they were being led away, my father looked up. His eyes found mine across the crowded room. For a split second, the noise of the reporters, the flashing cameras, the murmur of the crowd, it all faded away. There was no anger left in his gaze, no hatred. There was only a vast, empty expanse of ruin. I saw the ghost of the father I once worshipped and the stranger he had become. I held his gaze, not with triumph, but with a profound and aching sadness. Then he was gone, led through a side door, out of the courtroom, and out of my life. The battle was won. But standing there, in the aftershock of the explosion I had detonated, I felt no elation. Only the hollow, ringing silence that follows a war. After the verdict, after the storm of reporters had finally subsided, I was escorted to Judge Miller's chambers. He stood waiting by the window, his judge's robe gone, revealing the simple, crisp uniform of a retired Marine colonel. The room was quiet, lined with books and smelling of old leather and justice. He turned to face me, and the stern, impartial mask of the federal judge was replaced by the quiet, knowing gaze of a fellow soldier. General Marcus would be proud of you today, Captain, he said, his voice warm with a respect that went beyond the courtroom. He always believed that true loyalty is to the truth, not to rank or to bloodline. You proved him right. His words were the final validation I needed. It wasn't just a legal victory anymore, it was a victory of honor. It was the full-throated approval from the world my grandfather had built, the world I'd fought so hard to belong to. I simply nodded, unable to speak, and gave him the crispest salute I had ever rendered. He returned it. Outside the courthouse, Jake was waiting, a silent, steady presence in the swirling chaos. He shielded me as we pushed through the mob of cameras and microphones. A reporter shoved a microphone in my face, her voice sharp. Captain Carey, how does it feel to finally get your revenge? I stopped. The question hung in the air. I looked at the reporter, but I was speaking to the world. This was never about revenge, I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying over the din. Revenge is about the past. This was about the future. It was a recalibration of a moral compass. The mission is complete. I didn't answer any more questions. Jake and I got into his car and drove away, leaving the noise and the spectacle behind. We didn't celebrate. There were no champagne toasts or triumphant cheers. There was only a profound sense of relief, the deep, bone-weary quiet of a soldier finally returning home from a long and brutal war. 1 year later, a lot had changed. I'd completed my final tour of duty, honorably discharged from the army I loved, and I had taken my rightful place as the CEO of Carey Defense Solutions. But my first significant act as leader didn't take place in the boardroom. It took place on the shores of Lake Tahoe. I drove up to the lodge alone, the same lodge where the final trap had been set. It was late afternoon, and the setting sun cast a golden, forgiving light across the water. I walked down to the pier, holding the original handwritten letter from my grandfather. I read his words one last time, committing them to my heart. Then I lit a match and set the corner of the paper on fire. I watched as the flames consumed the page, turning his strong, confident script into black, curling ash. It wasn't an act of forgetting. It was an act of liberation. I was keeping the lesson but releasing myself from the weight of the war. I let the ashes drift from my fingers, scattering them over the calm blue water, and with them, I let go of the last remnants of my pain. Back in DC, I began the real work. I didn't just want to run the company, I wanted to rebuild its soul. My father had led with a top-down command and control style. I did the opposite. Inspired by the writings of leaders like Simon Sinek, I instituted a culture of servant leadership. I listened to my engineers. I empowered my managers. I made it clear that our primary mission was not to maximize profit, but to protect the soldiers who used our equipment. Honor, I told them, would be our guiding principle. I also established the Marcus Carey Foundation for Ethical Defense Leadership, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal support and whistleblower protection for any service member or defense employee who dared to speak truth to power. Last spring, I was invited back to West Point to be the keynote speaker at the very scholarship ceremony I had been barred from. Standing on that hallowed stage, looking out at the sea of young, hopeful faces in their crisp gray uniforms, my journey came full circle. After my speech, a young female cadet stood up to ask a question. "Ma'am," she began, her voice nervous but determined, "after everything you went through, have you forgiven your family?" The question settled over the auditorium. I thought for a long moment, not about them, but about the true meaning of the word. "In the military," I answered, my voice quiet but firm, "we don't talk a lot about forgiveness. We talk about accountability, and we talk about moving forward. They have been held accountable for their actions by the law, and I have been held accountable for mine." I looked out at all of them, the future leaders of the Army. "My most important action now," I continued, "the one I hold myself accountable for every single day, is to build a legacy that a soldier can be proud of, to build a company they can trust with their lives." The story ends here, but my work continues. Back in my office, the large, intimidating portrait of my father that once hung in the boardroom is gone. In its place, I hung the old faded photograph of my grandfather. Beneath it, I had a simple brass plaque engraved. It doesn't list his accomplishments or his rank. It just says 4 words, the words that have become my compass, my constitution. Honor is what you build. My war is over, but the most important work, the building, is something we all do every day. My story is just one story of turning pain into purpose. Maybe you're building a new career after a setback, rebuilding trust that was broken, or simply building a life defined by your own values, not by the labels others try to give you. If you believe that our true legacy is what we build from the ashes, then please like this video to show your support and subscribe to the channel. This is a community for survivors, for fighters, and for builders. Thank you for listening.